If the roots of the Cold War were already growing out of the end of the Second World War, and if that is indeed evidenced in what we see happening over the course of the three major meetings of the Big Three from 1943 into 1945, then the years 1946 and 47 will build upon those roots, the building blocks that were already put in place. In 1944 and 45, the Soviet Union was able to basically install, through a variety of means, friendly governments in both Yugoslavia and Albania. 1946 to 1947, similarly friendly governments, often communist governments, but at a minimum Soviet sympathetic governments, would be installed in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland. And in 1948, Czechoslovakia, now partly Slovakia and the Czech Republic, would see the installation, again, of another Soviet-friendly government. I think part of understanding the Cold War is understanding the onset of this sense, particularly in the West, that the Soviet Union was ultimately bent on expansion. One of the keystones for understanding where this sort of thinking comes from in the West, but also it's a reflection of the development of this sort of thinking about the Soviet intentions, will be a letter from George Kennan. Kennan was a consultant who had been part of the larger diplomatic mission in the Soviet Union during the war. He was a diplomat who spoke fluent Russian and really had a sort of on-the-scene view of events from Moscow, from the heart of the Soviet Union. In 1946, Kennan produced, partly out of his role as a consultant, an advisor to Averell Harriman, Kennan produced what came to be known as the Long Telegram. And it's sort of a white report, a white sheet. It lists, it makes the case, or a particular case, about how Soviet diplomacy and Soviet actions should be understood. This report by George Kennan basically suggests that the Soviet Union, that Stalin, is set on the expansion of communism. Kennan was an opponent of communism, and he believed that the Soviet Union, given a chance, had a desire to expand its influence not merely in Central and Eastern Europe, not merely based on those elections and the governments installed that we would have seen by 46 in Central and Eastern Europe, but more broadly around the world. So that very clearly he is voicing this perception of the world as now a matter of contest between two opposing players, the Soviet Union on one side and primarily the United States or the West on the other. What he proposes then, what he suggests as an antidote to this Soviet drive for expansion, will be a policy that will come to be known in time as containment. The idea that wherever we see evidence, and I say we, I shouldn't say we, but the United States sees evidence of Soviet expansion or expansive behavior, the United States would have an obligation to respond in kind in order to check that expansion, thus containing the Soviet Union and its aspirations. From a policy perspective, understand how important Kennan's Long Telegram is, and this is 46, because it puts people in a particular mindset. It begins encouraging the emergence of a particular mindset about how the world operates. Whether Kennan was right or wrong in his reading of Soviet intentions is perhaps less relevant than the impact the Long Telegram and subsequent efforts by Kennan would have on U.S. foreign policy throughout the rest of the Cold War. The sort of stated policy of the United States becomes a policy of containment, and that's a really important term. It wasn't just George Kennan, of course. Another major figure who would basically offer the same kind of assessment of global affairs in 1946 was no less a figure than Winston Churchill. Churchill was invited to come to the United States, and accompanied by President Harry Truman, they traveled to Missouri, and Churchill gave, again, an extraordinarily important speech in Fulton, Missouri, at Westminster College. And this speech has come to be known as the Iron Curtain speech, because it's in this speech that Winston Churchill says or propounds this notion that Europe has effectively been divided now. Now remember, this is the same Churchill who was talking about spheres of influence way back when in 1944, but here he's saying it's effectively been divided. That north-south line that we talked about it's set now. And he calls that line of demarcation an iron curtain. On the one side, you have the West with its ideals, certainly the ideals that Churchill sees in the West. Not everybody might agree with Churchill, but there they are. And then the ideals of the totalitarian communist state, the authoritarian Stalin, in which free and fair elections are not going to happen, in which ultimately what you'll have is a sort of dictatorial communist Soviet-style colonization going on. So that he's arguing here there's a clear choice. It's one or the other. Choose and decide how the West will respond. It's very much like what Kennan is proposing in his long telegram. In 1947, it really comes to a head for the United States. The U.S., has avoided making outright or sort of entering the conflict directly up to this point. But in 1947, the U.S. is forced to make a choice of how it's going to respond and to begin putting to use this new doctrine of containment that's begun to evolve. And the choice comes in no less a place than Greece. Because in Greece, in the Mediterranean, but in Greece in particular, you have what amounts to a civil war ongoing. Following the Second World War, the government that's in power, which tends to be sympathetic toward the West, confronts an insurgency led by Greek communists. The British, sort of as part of their long-standing role in the world as the imperial power and having an interest in the Mediterranean and Greece, partly because of the Suez Canal, the British have been supplying material and funding to the Greek government as they seek to fight off this communist insurgency. But you have to remember that Britain and its economic power have been severely damaged during the Second World War. The result is that by 1947, it's become clear that Britain can no longer continue or no longer has the desire to continue supporting the Greek government. And so it falls to the United States to assume the mantle, to become, in essence, the world's police personnel. Harry Truman responds in March of 1947 with what comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine. It's more or less a pledge, but it's like the Monroe Doctrine. It's where the U.S., usually the chief executive, says, hey, this is going to be our policy. We're announcing this to the world. What Truman says, and I want to be very careful here, but he says that the United States will, quote, will support, quote, free peoples when they are, quote, resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Now, what this means is that in the case of an insurgency where a government, i.e. a friendly government to the U.S. or to the West, is being challenged by groups from within its own population, the United States will believe it in its own interest to intervene, to keep certain forces from gaining the ascendancy. Similarly, the United States says, or Truman says, that the U.S. is ready to come to the aid of any government, any nation that faces aggression from outside its borders. Clearly now, by 47, the United States is prepared to engage directly in supporting resistance to what may be perceived as expansion by communist forces or by the Soviet Union. To that end, in announcing this Truman Doctrine, Harry Truman will ask Congress and will receive an appropriation for military aid and support for several governments, including Greece, that are being threatened. The rationale, very simply, is a fear that if you begin not to stand up, not to halt aggression where it's found, the idea is that that aggression will continue to spread. And one of the analogies used, and notice it's being used against our former ally, the Soviet Union, is the analogy of infection. You may recall that prior to the Second World War, what had ruled primarily in Britain and really been the predominant idea among huge portions of the American population was that the proper course to deal with Hitler was appeasement. That the proper course was to give a little, but ultimately prevent outright conflict. I'm not saying that was a right or wrong decision, what ultimately happened with World War II, but I want to suggest that the lesson that many Americans and many in the West, including Britain, had taken from that example of appeasement had been that you cannot give. You cannot just accede to the demands made by sort of these dictators or by people in power who are saying either you give me X or you're going to get war, you're going to get trouble. It's a form of blackmail. So there is sort of that sentiment running around, and it is informing in part this reaction by Harry Truman in 1947 and this fear that giving on one issue will lead then to giving on more issues or surrendering whole portions of the globe to what's clearly been identified by elements like Churchill and Kennan as a threat to the West and ultimately to this idea of freedom. Along these same lines of action by the United States, we have in June of 1947 the introduction of an outright plan for economic and reconstruction assistance to Europe. While countries in Central and Eastern Europe were basically coming under the control of governments that were friendly to the Soviet Union or outright communist, there were nations in Western Europe that were in trouble, that were threatened by the rise of communism. And you have to go back and think here about the destruction that the war had wrought. Basically, in 1946-47, in the winter, you have in Germany a threat, more than a threat. You have starvation, you have famine. Infrastructures are wiped out. The ability to move food and move goods, bridges blown up that will have to be rebuilt. It's an absolute mess. And in those conditions, as people are starving and looking for whatever assistance they can find, or also looking for people to blame for this problem, it makes sense that they would turn to, radical solutions. And what we see in France, what we see in Germany are the emergence of sort of growing communist contingents and communist support. Well, remember, the idea is that communism is, first of all, negative, has been for some time, but that it's looking for expansion. How do you battle that in the West? It's not just military aid then that the United States will provide after the war in the immediate post-war years, but in fact, it will be economic assistance as well. June of 1947, the plan is announced by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, who of course had been instrumental as a general, as a military man during World War II. His goal, arguably, will be humanistic, to suggest that they're just human. It's a human disaster, that relief efforts are necessitated to help people deal with famine, hunger, unemployment, you name it, to get the economies of Europe restarted again. So it's a humanitarian effort. It will come to be known as the Marshall Plan. And in the end, it will bring about $13.5 billion in aid, which is a huge and astounding amount in 1947, but $13.5 billion in aid to Western Europe. This aid was rejected by the Soviet Union and ultimately, under some compulsion, would be rejected by its satellite nations. But what it meant, what the Marshall Plan ultimately meant, was European recovery. It was a diplomatic tool which allowed the U.S. to work against the rise of communism, which was understood to be Soviet-inspired in Western nations, much as it was working against it in Greece. But it also created or helped to create some important markets for America's post-war production. Remember that the U.S. is coming out of the war as the arsenal of democracy. Massive production capabilities have been put to work for the war effort. And the question, in part, for Truman is, what does one do to avoid massive unemployment as the number of jobs decrease, as demand for American goods decreases after the war, as defense contracts are ended, and as the veterans return? Well, with the rest of the world in tatters, one clear option is to begin to create markets, to create economic growth abroad that can then absorb the products from America's factories and America's fields. That, too, is in part what the Marshall Plan was all about. It's humanitarian, it's anti-communism, it's also economics on the domestic front. All of these things are involved in the Marshall Plan and what comes of it. In the next segment, I'm going to take up the issue of Berlin, and we'll move to 1948 and talk a bit about the Berlin airlift. And we'll cover that then.